Okay, what you're looking at here is a Colt Lawman or Lawman Mark III, caliber .357. It's a revolver, of course, 6-shot, 4-inch barrel, polished blued steel, wooden grips. These are the original grips. This firearm was made in 1972. It's got fixed sights, an unshrouded ejector rod. It's got call that kind of a grooved trigger. Kind of a wide hammer. I don't believe this was their target hammer though. I think this was just a regular hammer. Since it was made in 1972, it has, I'll show you that the revolver is indeed unloaded. It has recessed cylinders. Now, I'll explain the differences in the type of recessing that various manufacturers do a little bit later, but suffice it to say for now it has recessed cylinders, and it is empty. And there we go. Now Colt has been making double action revolvers for a long time. I think before the turn of the 20th century, so in the late 1900s, or 1800s, I'm sorry, in the late 1800s they developed their first double action revolvers. And they weren't very popular initially. They weren't bought by militaries. Generally, police departments and individuals were buying them. And they were mostly in caliber .38 special. The U.S. Army did buy a number of their double action revolvers. The model 1917 for World War I, because they were already tooled to make it, and it was cheaper to produce those than it was the Colt 1911, and they made it in the same caliber. They were both .45 automatic. This bluing is kind of worn on this one. There was actually a good bit of rust. It wasn't in too good of condition when I got it. I'll explain more about the condition a little bit later. You can see a chip out of the grip there. Decent gun. Little heavy trigger pull. I'm going to try and correct that. It has some flaws, and I'll go over those, and I'll actually correct one a little bit later in the video. So for now, let me explain more about the differences between this and other Colt double action revolvers. The primary difference in this one compared to the Smith & Wesson is that it's got a side plate on the left hand side. You notice there's a screw there. There's a screw under the grip in this area, and the top of the side plate, you can barely see it along here. You can see it along here, and the side plate comes off of the left hand side of the gun. A Smith & Wesson has a side plate on the right hand side of the gun. You can see a screw there, a screw there. There's also what used to be a screw here on earlier guns, and there's a screw hidden by the grip, and also on earlier guns there's another screw. I believe it was right here. I do not have a 5 screw. This would be a 3 screw. 1, 2, 3. Having a screw there would be either a 4 or a 5 screw, and then the final screw in the front would be a 5 screw. And this is a Smith & Wesson model 66, and I'll explain more about the differences in a minute. Back to the Colt. To check the Colt to see if it's loaded, unloaded, or what have you, you need to pull back on the cylinder release and at the same time push the cylinder from the other side, and it swings open. And then you can look down. If the chambers are empty, there's 6 in this one. If the chambers are empty, that means it's unloaded. Got an ejector rod here. Imagine you had spent casings in there. You push the ejector rod out and it pushes the spent casings out. You'd want to do that kind of smartly, and that would be, or push it against the palm of your hand, because sometimes those cases are going to be stuck in there kind of tight. Okay. One difference between this and most other double action revolvers is that the cylinder turns the opposite direction of what you'd expect. When you pull the hammer back, the cylinder, as you'll watch, rotates to the right. Again, cylinder rotates to the right. Once again, my Smith & Wesson for comparison. Note it is also empty. When you pull the hammer back, cylinder rotates to the left. Once again, pull the hammer back, cylinder rotates to the left. I'll also point out another difference. On the Smith & Wesson, to release the cylinder, you push forward on the cylinder latch, and again also push the cylinder the same direction. Your ejector rod operates in a similar manner, but one thing that the Smith & Wesson has different is that it locks up in the front. You can see that little, I'm trying to get that, see that little plunger that comes up there? That plunger is pushed when I push this little detent in. That's pushed from there, which is what your cylinder release does. Now that little hole there engages with this little device to lock the cylinder. So it locks at the front of the, well, this would be a ejector rod shroud, and it also locks at the back here. Well, Colt has a reputation for being a very strong gun, so it doesn't need anything up here. Didn't seem to hurt the Colt. I wouldn't say that the Smith & Wesson way of doing things was gimmicky, because it was different, because they felt the need to have that extra lockup in the front. Colt locks up in the rear. Again, a little bit different on how it locks up. This has a spring loaded thumb latch that engages in that little recessed hole there. You can see it. Should be able to see it pretty well. To lock up the cylinder. Only at that point. The other point that I guess you can consider it to be held in by is, I think that's called a crane, that holds the cylinder in the front. Okay. You might have noticed something different as well when I open the cylinder from your revolver. Most modern revolvers have a smooth cylinder face. This one has what's called recessed cylinders. So the cartridge would fit down inside of this little recess around here, so that when you close the cylinder, there's very little gap in between the cylinder, the face of the cylinder, and the rear of the revolver. Of course, the gap up here isn't what I'm talking about. There's a gap between the cylinder and the barrel that you can see really clearly there. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about between the rear of the cylinder and the face of the receiver or the frame there. Now, there's a belief that the gas from a cartridge going off would sneak around the side of the cartridge and out around the base, and can go out in either direction, from the back of the cylinder. And that just makes it make an extra right turn or so. It's also a nice touch, so you can't see the cartridges in there. Makes it nicer. In some people's eyes, I believe it's actually a negative for a couple of reasons. The main reason is if you have a disabled ejector rod and you need to get the cartridge out of there somehow, or maybe you just want to pull one or two cartridges that you fired out and replace them, well, you can't get your thumbnail underneath a recessed cartridge. You kind of have to push the ejector a little bit, grab the cartridge, and pull them out. And that's not why they switched to flat-faced cylinders. They actually switched to because it was cheaper, less machining operations. But that is one thing to consider. Don't consider something just because it looks better or because people have told you it's better. You have to judge it on its own merits. I prefer a conventional modern cylinder without the recesses for that reason. That doesn't mean I'm going to be throwing this gun in the trash. It just means it's a little bit different. Okay, so that's recessed cylinders. You'll also notice at the top of the barrel here is missing something that your Smith & Wesson might have, which is a pin. You hear a lot of talk about pinned and recessed revolvers. I'll explain that on my pinned and recessed Smith & Wesson. We'll leave the Colt in the background since this video is on the Colt. Okay, notice that the cylinder is also recessed at the back. You can see a little gap there between the front of the cylinder and the barrel. I cannot get just a little bit. I guess I can get a little bit of movement on that. But there's that pin. And that pin goes through the threads on the barrel, and it's supposed to lock it and keep the barrel, which is threaded to the receiver. Everything from here forward, this whole part here is the barrel, and then they've got an extension that kind of sticks in there through the receiver, and then they put that little pin in there to keep it from rotating. I haven't seen them rotate too often, so I don't think that's as big a deal as they might have thought it was at the time. They omitted that, I believe, in the mid-70s, early 80s. And then sometime after that, they had omitted the recessed cylinders. But this Smith & Wesson has recessed cylinders and a pinned barrel. It would be called a pinned and recessed. For those initiated folks, this is a model 66-1. It's an early stainless steel gun. And it's fairly nice. I kind of resurrected this, refinished the grips. The finish on it was kind of rough at the time, and I rebuffed it out and took out a lot of the fine scratches. I didn't take everything out. I haven't used this gun too much. I didn't really refinish it, but I am a metal worker and I'm fairly good at that, and found the need to try and fix it myself. And you'll notice these parts here, the trigger and hammer on the Smith & Wesson are, I believe that's chrome plating. Smith & Wesson stopped doing that. They were having quality control issues. They weren't able to keep the gun in good operating shape with the chrome parts, so they switched to case hardening on modern stainless steel Smith & Wessons. And you'll notice if you can look really hard, I don't know how well it's going to turn out in my video, but the hammer and the trigger on the Colt in 1972 were already color case hardened. And I think that was more of a finished choice for them than you know, them choosing to do that for having tried something else that didn't work. Okay, that's enough for the introduction video. Now I'm going to explain a couple of things here and see if I can't help everybody out here. This Colt had an issue with it when I first bought it, and that issue was with the ejector rod. And the ejector rod is turning. As you can see, the cylinder is not turning. It means the ejector rod is not tight. I could finger tighten it, but my fingers are not as strong as a 357 Magnum, and I think the 357 Magnum wins. Well, when I got this gun, it did not have an ejector rod. I had to buy this ejector rod. I believe it's a reproduction. I had to buy this ejector rod online from Numrich Gun Parts, or Gun Parts Corporation, and they had it in stock, and I was happy. And I got this gun for less money because of it, but again, that's knowing what you're paying for. So these have a tendency to work loose. It's a righty-tighty. I believe on the Smith & Wesson it's the opposite direction. So one thing I could do is I could just remember to tighten it every time I go to the range or whenever I have the trouble, or I could put a dab of Loctite on it. And in my follow-up video, I'm going to show you how to put a dab of Loctite on it without gumming up the cylinder with too much Loctite. And I hope everybody's happy with this video. I haven't talked on any of my other videos before on YouTube, but I felt the need to do it that way rather than explain in the nomenclature. I'm going to do another video, and that other video is going to have me putting Loctite on the ejector rod, and also installing a reduced power hammer spring and trigger return spring. And those are products by Wolf Performance. And feel free to favorite this video, click through any advertising links that are on there, and I will see you in the next video.